I'm not a medieval historian, so one of the problems for me over the last 2 years has been to learn about medieval history and the things connected with it. The other great problem was how to translate this or interpret it for children as young as 8, although this afternoon it turned out to be children who were even younger. One of the things I thought was, whilst the Charter is really, really interesting for adults because it tells us a lot about Congleton, it's a bit dry as dust for children. So what I chose to do was to make a diorama. And that started 18 months of cutting up lollipop sticks, searching the web frantically for figures that might work in it, and trying to use my imagination about what the town of Congleton might have looked like 750 years ago. And the result is the diorama that you're going to see in a moment. So what did the medieval town of Congleton look like? We don't know. We have to imagine it, and the imagining of it also requires some effort to discover exactly what we do know, some of which is for sure, some of which we've got to really root about in the evidence. We know that at the time of the Charter, Congleton had a mill. We know that it had burghers who, if you want to know what they are, they were free men. It was a very important distinction because the other people who will have lived in this area are the villeins, the people who were required to work on a lord's land several days a week as rent for their own holdings, and who were not free to leave. That was an enormously important distinction between people at this time. We know that they were very, very religious people. Their piety might not particularly impress us because they were also a very cruel people in some ways. We know things about the town which are strange, such as the fact that the River Dane ran through it, but perhaps not where it runs now, because it was embanked at a later age, having flooded the town, which suggests that some of the wooden houses were actually very close to the river. We know that at some stage in its history, it had acquired a church, and not very long after the Charter was given, we know that people were fighting very hard to retain their church. The point about the church being that Congleton didn't have a parish. The actual parish was in Asbury. If you went to the church in Congleton, then you could not be christened, married, or buried there. You had to go over to Asbury, and the distance between them was known as Priesty Fields, because it was thought that the priest possibly walked along that to come and administer to the people of Congleton. If we look at the way in which medieval society works, it's a strange thing to us. If we imagined a medieval person being brought into the modern world in a time machine, I should think they'd be scared rigid. And I can tell you that if somebody took me in a time machine and placed me in the medieval world, I would definitely be scared rigid. As you come into town from the north, you're going to come down a road called Rood Hill. It's an old place name, and that's why we know that at the bottom of the hill is a church. We do know it also from some other records. And if you come down Rood Hill, in a town which is basically strategically just there because it's on a north-south route, then you're going to come to the bridge which crosses the Dane. On your right is the church, which is, as I've said, a chapel of ease. As you come over the Dane, you start to meet the houses of the town, and they show us something about the occupation. If you stand on the bridge and you look across to the meadows, you will see the mill. We know about the mill because it's mentioned in the Charter. It's a bit of a raw deal for people of Congleton, really. The Lord of the Manor is required to provide a mill. but he has a nice little catch in it. The people of the town must use the mill, and 1/5 of their grain that is ground there has to go to the lord of the manor as a kind of tax. If you ground your meal elsewhere, you might be in trouble. Carry on over the bridge and you're starting to go through what is now Mill Street. Because Congleton has been so heavily overlain by other building, first of all, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, when mills and mill houses was scattered right across the town, and then much later building, particularly road building, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even the present day, even the things that were left have now disappeared. We're a town that hasn't particularly looked after that part of its heritage. But textiles have always played, we think, a big part in the life of Congleton. We're assuming it, but we have to remember that at this time, the wool trade was particularly important to the economy of England. Not at this particular time, but not long afterwards, it accounted for 30% of the economy. That is a jolly great bit of your economy. Here in our model, as you come over the bridge, you can see in front of you the tenter grounds where people stretched the wool or the linen to dry. If you're on tenter hooks, you're being subjected to the same kind of treatment that the wet cloth was subjected to. And we have, on the left of us, you can see the fuller's house and the fuller's working grounds. We get to the Dyers House. He too has to have tenter fields where the cloth is stretched out to dry. And we can see his warehouse and dyeing workshop. He's dyeing cloth in vats with dyes which have come from natural materials such as woad or weld. It was a time when clothes might have looked a bit shabby, but people really valued cloth and they really valued the colours in it. A very clever dyer would import cloth which gave much richer colours and deeper colours. At the back of the workshop we can see a little donkey house. It's in the Potter's Yard. And what we need to understand about this time is that people were the main beasts of burden, but anyone wishing to go very far with their stuff to sell it had to use a donkey or a mule or a horse. Donkeys and mules were very hard worked in these times. In this instance, we're standing behind the Potter's house, and we can see that the two chaps are having a bit of an argument because they've broken part of their merchandise. What we don't know is whether they've produced the pots inside their house or whether they've simply imported them and are now on their way to sell them. But this was a period when pottery was beginning to increase in manufacture and style. Houses were built very close together in medieval times. Had to leave these a little bit apart because otherwise we wouldn't be able to see into them. But across the road from the Potter's house is the Shoemaker's house. In my imagination, this chap was a bit of a slacker. In fact, he's at the back of the pub having a fight with somebody. Behind his house is a shack, a rather worn shack. What we don't know is whether this shack is in some way connected to the shoemaker, but what we can see is two men having a brawl at the back of a pub. It's actually an ale house and it's called the Foaming Quart. And in my imagination again, this is a shoemaker having a fight because he's got drunk early in the morning, which might explain why his business is not doing terribly well. Next to him you can see the brew house. And the ale is being brewed by women. There was nothing uncommon about this. They were known as alewives. In the house, women made ale, small ale, for people to drink. That's a very weak brew. In the pubs, inns and taverns, they made proper beer. And the person most likely to be brewing it was probably a woman, because they'd had so much experience. As we pass the Foaming Quart, on our right-hand side, we're going to see the houses of the Fairlanes. the peasant class that were tied to the land and who had to work several days a week on the lord's holdings. In exchange for this, they got tenure of the land. They could keep pigs, hens, grow crops on the land, as well as having to plough and harrow the fields. If we look at the chappie on the right, who is digging up his cabbage, we'll see his oxen. They were required to keep teams of oxen to plough the land. So in addition to having to plough the Lord's land, they had to feed the oxen who did the work. Of course, we don't know exactly who the tradespeople would be in Congleton at this time, but there are some trades that must have had a representative here in the town, and one of them is the carpenter, because who else builds wooden houses? Here we can see that this carpenter has a little son, and he's built for him a horse's head on a stick. So it wasn't all work, there was a bit of play in there. He's followed fairly rapidly by the smith, another really seriously important tradesperson. This was a time when the use of iron was increasing, and it was no longer a practical proposition for the people to make their own iron goods. You'd have to go to the trouble of finding the smelted iron, you would have to hammer them, you have to have a smithy, really, to work them. So the smith was a much sought after craftsman. You can see his grindstone, his anvil, and at the back you'll notice that he's built himself a forge. This matters because in this forge there's a chimney, and chimneys were something you're not going to see on any of the other houses. Any smoke that came out of them, and there will be smoke because the fires were lit on a little stone hearth in the middle of the rooms, came out of a hole in the roof. There must have been hell to live in. Opposite the smith is another very important craftsman. It's a cooper. In our modern age, because materials such as metals and plastic have overtaken the use of wood in society, we forget how important it was. If you wanted to store anything, wet, dry, bulky, whatever, the person you turned to first was the man who made the barrels, the tubs, the churns, and so on, the cooper. If your name's Cooper, that's what your ancestor may well have done for a living a long, long time ago. And at last we've reached the Traveller's Joy Tavern. We don't know if there was ever a tavern in this town called that, but there's a very good chance that there will have been a tavern. We know that this is a place where people can drink beer or wine and where they can eat food, and we know this because of the strange bush which is hung above the door. People couldn't read, so signs, pub signs such as we know them, were not used at this time. But the pole in this tree, bush, whatever we care to call it, dates back to Roman times when they hung a hot pole out of the building. The bush at the end tells us that you can buy food here, and this will be the big inn where people stayed. In the courtyard in front, we can see the ale taster trying out the wine, which will have been imported from France. We have been travelling along a rutted, muddy road. As we've had warm weather recently, the mud may have dried, but along this road there will have been many obstacles. Cow pats, donkey pats, anything that people cared to throw out of their houses, and of course animals and birds roamed free around this town. On our left is the town well. Water was a very important substance then as now, and every last drop had to be carried in a bucket or other receptacle from the well to wherever its ultimate destination was. Congleton probably had quite a lot of wells. It certainly had rivers and brooks. But water is an essential stuff of life, and everybody had to find a source of it. When I came to dispose of it after use, we can see somebody on the edge of the cooper's house who is throwing it out into the road. When you finish with the water or more noxious substances, you threw it on the road or, just possibly, into the rivers. No plumbing in this age. We have reached a junction in the King's Highway, which is what this road was later known as. If we were to turn right, we'd go to the West Road, where some of the wealthier burgesses eventually moved. If we were to turn left and start our journey across Duck Street, we would eventually just turn right by the Swan Inn to go up the road, still the King's Highway, to Fall Hollow. This used to be the main road out of Congleton. As we pass the Swan Inn, we note that in Congleton, years ago, it was known that there was a pub called the Swan and a pub called the Lion, and it's thought the two have been combined to make the Lion and Swan, still going strong in modern day Congleton. As we advance down Duke Street, which is probably a corruption of Duck Street because there were plenty of waterfowl in this area, we see on our right the butcher's shop. At the end of his building we can see a cockle shell. Well, what's that about? It tells us a little story. It tells us that the butcher is a very devout man and he has made a pilgrimage to St. James of Compostella's shrine in Spain. You can see that one of the farmers is carrying a pig, perhaps to be slaughtered, for the butcher appears to be a man who enjoys slaughtering pigs. He's certainly got plenty of pig stuff on offer in his shop. We have now reached the bridge over the Houghty Brook. We don't know it now perhaps, but the Houghty Brook hasn't always run under the town, but ran through the town. It was obviously a haven for wildlife, especially the ducks, and it ran its course round the side of the town and finally met up with the River Dane. In front of us is the draper's house. It's cloth again, and the draper is another fairly wealthy tradesperson in the town. Judging from the donkeys in his establishment, he travels with his cloth to other places, perhaps to fairs. We have now come to one of the wealthiest merchants in the town, a wool merchant. The sale of wool was lucrative and very much appreciated as part of an enormous trade that took place across the length and breadth of England and over the Channel to places like Flanders. Next to the house we can see some market stalls. In 1272 there wasn't necessarily a market, but it soon followed. We can see that people are selling fast food and produce from their gardens or their landholdings. And to the right we can see the market cross. It was an important focus for the town, and we can see on its steps a beggar. He's lost a leg, poor man, but we have to remember that in that age it was considered good for the soul to give alms to those who begged or who were unfortunate enough to deserve help and support from proper Christians. Fish days were compulsory several days a week in medieval England. The fish must have come from the rivers and the lakes that abounded around Congleton. We know that Congleton had a Moot Hall. I've situated this opposite to the wool merchant's house. This is where the important men of the town, the traders, the merchants, the craftsmen would meet to discuss the affairs of the town. Although the houses didn't have fireplaces and chimneys at this period, people were beginning to experiment very much with the styles of them. This house is in the process of being built. It's almost finished, but at some stage it will be embellished with very nice wrought iron hinges. on the shutters and doors. What it won't have at this period is glass in the windows. That is reserved for the churches and the homes of the very great men of the realm. In a society that was mostly agrarian, predominantly agrarian, in which everybody depended upon corn for their staple diet of bread or pottage, it was very important to store the grain. When we think of bread, we tend to think of wheaten bread, but that was the most expensive kind and possibly not the grain that was grown in the area at this time. Barley, oats and rye were also grown. What happened during the harvest was that everybody joined in the harvest and everybody carried the cereal to a place called a granary. Here, using flails, they thrashed it on the threshing floor, and then they took the straw off to serve in their houses for their cattle, and they took the grain home or to the mill to grind. Unfortunately, they couldn't read and write, so they depended upon the steward of the manor of the Lord of the Manor's property to keep a tally of which was their helping of the harvest. As we look down the street, we can see the stocks where defaulters were punished. We can see the haycart, which is gathering in the grain to take it to the granary. And below that, we can see the bakehouse. This was a building owned by the Lord of the Manor. He rented it out to the baker, but it was a requirement that the baker would bake the bread and the pies of the people who lived in the town. Most houses at the time did not own their own ovens. Probably a good thing, given that the houses, which are constructed from wattle and daub and wood, were very susceptible to fire. Meat was not necessarily something that dominated the diet of people at the time. Cattle, animals were very expensive things to keep, especially over the winter time when food for the winter was very scarce. Here we see an old lady who is keeping chickens. Chickens were actually a food that was available to poorer people. She is just about to behead one. As we look across the water meadows on the opposite side of the town, we see a farmstead. One of the women is milking a cow. These farmers keep cattle. Perhaps they also keep sheep, ducks, geese, any number of animals. But most importantly, they keep animals that will give milk. And we can see that they are making cheese inside the farmhouse. Cheese was an important source of food at the time. It could be soft or it could be hard, like our own famous Cheshire cheese. The Dovecot. Close by the river is the Dovecot. We don't actually know where the manor of Congleton was situated, and we don't know where the Dovecot was, but we know that there was one because a few years after the charter, de Lacy sold it. The way in which this building worked was that around the walls there were lots and lots of pigeonholes, and in these were the nests for the doves. A man used to go round the building and knock the nest down to the floor. It was the baby pigeons, whose wings were not developed, who made the finest tasting. The villagers or townspeople hated dovecots in their villages and towns because they raided the cornfields and ate the crops. The mill was such an important building in any town, for here was where the cereal crops were ground, and without grinding they were not much use. This mill was owned by the Lord of the Manor, typical thing in any village or town. He took a share of the produce. A fifth of the grain went to him as a tax. Just to sew it up a little bit, he did insist that people had to use the mill, unless it had insufficient capacity, in which case they could take their grain elsewhere. You have just had a tour of an imagined town of Congleton in 1272. We really don't know enough about the town to know whether what I have imagined is correct or not. Even hills and rivers change, so even the scenery is perhaps not correct. But one thing will have been, it will have been very green, very pleasant,